Hey folks, welcome to Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. I've got a list of things I wish I knew sooner, things I'd do differently in my garden. Let's go see. Do you ever wish that you could go back in time and start over in gardening with what you know now? Let's talk about some of those things today. First thing I would have done differently is to garden more ergonomically. And what I mean is when I started out I was gardening in raised beds, and I was doing what you generally do when you build a raised bed is you get some 10x2s or some 8x2s or some 12x2 boards, and you make you a border for your garden, and that's great. And you put your soil in and you're off, you got several years of good gardening. What I found was that whenever I did that, I had 4 years, maybe 5 years before those boards rotted away and they were no good to me anymore. I'd have to replace them. And as soon as you replace one, you got to replace them all because it's just no fun. So I decided I was going to use cinder blocks. These cinder blocks right here have been in here for about 6 years now. And man, I'm so glad I did this. Now, there are concerns people have about cinder blocks being made with some toxic chemicals and things like that. You know, I don't really worry about that. I figure by the time they leach out of the soil, most of that chemical that's going to be in there is going to leach out, and I don't have to worry about it over time. But even so, it's not a concern for me. It might be a concern for you, and that's fine. If it's a concern for you, then don't do cinder blocks. But I chose to do cinder blocks. And the reason I did is because I can come in here now. They're not going to rot. But a second benefit is I can come in here now with my weed torch and flame weed my garden in between crops. I can get right up to it and it's not going to catch on fire, and it's permanent. The problem I found with these cinder blocks, as wonderful as they are, is the holes. Now these holes, people say, why don't you use it to plant things in, plant herbs and plant flowers and marigolds to keep the bugs and pests away? I've done that and it works. The problem is they're weed collectors. And they don't really, they're really too small to do anything with that I would really, they're not worth the effort to me. Second, when I go to weed my garden, I have to put my knees on here. Now I could use a weeding pad and put cardboard down, that's what I have to do. These edges will tear your knees up. So I don't like that. Furthermore, I've made my beds 4 feet wide. The inner diameter is 4 feet, they're 16 feet long. So that's about the standard width is 4 feet. They say you can get into the middle. Not if you have these cinder blocks tearing up your knees. It's hard to get into the middle of the garden. So I would do differently now. I would make my raised beds 3 feet wide and however long I want, so that I could actually reach the middle without breaking my back and without tearing up my knees. So those are some things I would do differently. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cap this. One of these days I'm going to cap these with a smooth cap. We got an airplane flying over, we got dogs barking. I can't make any money today, can I? What I'm going to do one of these days is I'm going to come back in with the flat caps they make for these cinder blocks, and I'm going to cap the whole thing with a smooth top. So that'll at least make it easier to come in and garden with my knees on there. You can sit on it, and I won't have to always be worrying about weeds. Man, when weeds get in here and get a hold, they're hard to get out, and I hate dealing with the weeds in here. So if I was going to do a raised bed differently, I'd still use cinder blocks, or I'd use some other kind of concrete block, but I would cap it and make sure the top is very smooth. And man, I had to learn that the hard way. I hope you don't. So the second thing I would do differently if I was beginning is I would listen to advice and I would garden year round. The general rule around here is that we get 100-degree summers, and come about August or September, man, it's hard to be out here and gardening. And so I plant crops like the cowpeas over here and the okra that will grow through the heat of the summer, but I don't come out much and I don't plant much. And that means that when it's time to get a fall garden started, traditionally I've been in the house and I haven't started my fall garden. And so I have nothing in my beds when it cools off, and it's nice to be gardening. And when it's nice to be outside again, it's too late to start your fall garden in most cases, at least here. And so, you know, I would have taken advice earlier that says garden year round when you live in a place where you can. and just push through the heat of the summer, and maybe start your seeds indoors like we've done this year. Prepare your beds in the cool of the evening, and don't waste that fall. Man, I've got some radishes coming up over here, and some beets. I've got some carrots, and the part that the cats didn't scratch up, ooh, they make me mad. In my other bed, I've got some more beets and some turnips, and in the house I've got some cabbages growing, tons of cabbage and cauliflower and some kale. So we're going to have a good fall garden this year, which normally isn't the case. Normally I let just whatever's growing in the garden, like these peppers right here, I would let them just go through the winter, and if they make it, great. If they don't, they don't. And I did that with my perpetual spinach last year, and it did wonderful. But you know, I could have had a whole garden full. So had I learned earlier about year-round gardening, that's what I would have done. I know about it now, so that's what we're doing. The third thing I would do, number 3, had I known, is to read more broadly and to study more broadly. I wish I had found things like Steve Solomon's book, Gardening When It Counts. And I wish I had read that earlier, because then I learned about compost and what your soil really needs. These are the kind of books that help you read broadly and break the conventions that kind of trap us into how we're supposed to grow our gardens and how we're supposed to do things. David DeGood, he's my YouTube buddy. I kind of like him a lot. Compost Everything. David DeGood was inspired by Steve Solomon. Once I read Compost Everything, man, I started composting literally everything I could compost, and I've got tons of compost this year. His book Grow or Die and his book Free Plants for Everyone, and he's got several others. These are the kind of books that I wish I had seen earlier in my gardening career, because they helped me to break out of the conventions that kind of stifled me and kept me gardening in the same old way that wasn't giving me the results I wanted. You can read books. Books are very, very useful because you always have them with you, and I like books. But man, YouTube, you can get a great education on YouTube if you're willing to break out of the normal, conventional gardening methods. Like compost is a big one. It's a big, good example, because there's a lot of rules about compost that people like to talk about. You know, oh, don't put dairy in your compost. Don't put meat in your compost. Oh, you can't compost that because it has fats in it. But in reality, you can compost all of that stuff. It's all good for your garden. Anything that was once living is compostable. It's just you got to take some steps to properly compost that stuff. But if you take those steps, you can put anything in your compost that was once living. So yeah, break out of the conventions. Read broadly. Read unconventional stuff. You don't have to take all the advice you get, but at least you'll have read, and you can pick and choose those things that will work for you. So that's number 3. Read and study more broadly. The fourth thing that I would do differently now, as opposed to when I began gardening, is to learn to experiment more. And by experimenting, I mean doing things that break the conventions for your area, or that seem to be interesting to do. I learned when I first started gardening, oh, you can't grow grapes in the South. You can't grow grapes. All you can grow are those muscadine grapes. And those muscadine grapes don't taste good. Nobody eats those. Nobody likes those. Well, what people in my area who are following convention think about when they think about muscadine grapes are our wild varieties. The cultivars that are unimproved wild, they're usually called Mustang grapes. In some areas they're called Scuppernongs. But I discovered by doing a little bit of research that there are cultivars of muscadine that are delicious. They make great jellies, make great fresh eating, make great wine. So I thought, I'm going to experiment. So I decided I was going to plant myself a micro vineyard. And a micro vineyard is a big experiment here. Micro because it's shorter than the canonical length of each run for the vines. They say you have to have a certain amount of space. I didn't have all that space, and I still wanted some grapes, so I shortened it. I did an experiment. This is the result of my experiment. These grapevines are 3.5 years old and put on about 30 pounds of grapes. I think it was 30 pounds of grapes this year. And you can see that they're nice and healthy and doing fine. So if you follow my channel, you've seen this. This is an experiment. You're not supposed to be able to grow grapes and make wine and the Texas coast, but we're doing it. So experiment, learn to try some new things. If you want to grow some strange, weird Asian fruit that no one's supposed to be able to grow here, try it. If you want to learn how to grow something that's not quite from your zone, maybe you're in the subtropics and you want to grow something tropical, learn how to do that. You can do it. There are methods you can do to push the zone, or to keep your plant safe from whatever it is about your zone that kills those plants. There are methods that you can experiment with, and you know, if you don't ever experiment, you'll never know. And it's fun too, especially fun when you've got something no one else in your garden club or your neighborhood has. So don't be afraid to experiment. I wish I had learned earlier to experiment. It's really so rewarding. This is a cheap tool. This is your typical big box hoe that comes from the garden center, and I've actually kind of sharpened it, put an edge on it, but this tool is eventually going to bust. This ferrule here is going to rust away, and it has no heft, no weight, and the angle of that head is not really good for the kinds of work I want to do with it. So, cheap tool. This is not a cheap tool. Now it's a bent, expensive tool. You can see it's been bent, but even a bent one works far better. I actually broke my other one that I have. This is a grub hoe. This is a grub hoe from easydigging.com. I don't get paid to say that. I just like their tools. These are made in Brazil. They make them all over the world. Cast iron head. It's really hefty. It's got some heft. It's much longer. It's wide enough to get in there and do the same work as a hoe, but it's longer so you can get in and actually dig with it, or do some tilling, or you can do some scraping and weeding and cultivating. Very versatile tool, and it's the weight that makes the work a whole lot easier. The long handle gives you a lot of heft and leverage. Obviously you got a lot of leverage if you can bend it. This was bent actually trying to pull a big piece of fence concrete out of the ground, but it still works. And since I broke my other one, it's supposed to be a little more angle in this. Since I broke my other one, I'm using this till I get a new handle. But better tools make your work a whole lot easier. Yeah, it costs money up front, and if you can't afford it, get what you can afford. I mean, you could work the whole garden with that cheap hoe over there. It's going to take you 2 or 3 times as long. I did my entire 4 by 16 bed. I went in and I tilled down about 8 inches, about as much as the hoe, in 20 minutes. And 20 minutes, man, that's unheard of with that cheap hoe. It would have taken me all day. Now, you got to buy what you can afford. You know, don't go into debt. Don't buy things that you can't afford. But when you can't afford a nice grub hoe instead of a garden hoe, plastic rake, and a weed puller you don't need, invest in the hoe. That's a good thing. Number 6. I was always told that you could only grow certain things in your area. Certain things were appropriate in a vegetable garden. And when you start a garden, everybody expects you to grow tomatoes and cucumbers and beans and, you know, maybe some radishes, and that's it. Get a seed catalog and grow what you want to grow. Don't let everybody pressure you into growing the things that you know, oh, you're supposed to grow that in a vegetable garden. You know, if you want to grow some strange, weird Asian fruit in your garden, grow it. Try it. Experiment. See if it works. Enjoy the fruit of your labors, and don't let folks pressure you into growing something just because they think they know what's best for you in your garden. You'd be surprised at how many people are going to tell you what you should do. You start a hobby, you start gardening, you start getting good at it, all of a sudden all the experts come out and putting their advice in your ear and saying, you know, you really should do this, you should try this. Here, I'm going to give you some seeds, try these. What if you don't like pinto beans and somebody gives you some pinto beans? You don't have to do what other people tell you to do. Do what makes you happy. Your garden's for you. It's your place of joy. But people say, why do you need 40 varieties of figs? I mean, doesn't one fig tree give you all the figs you need? It's not about need. It's about what I want, what makes me happy. It's about growing what I want to grow and not what you want to grow. If you want to grow one variety of figs, man, knock yourself out. If you want to grow 50 different kinds of ghost pepper, hey, that's your deal. It's not mine. Grow what brings you joy, what you want to grow. Man, my figs, they make me so happy, and that's what brings me joy. Number 7. Number 7 is about weeds. To hear the commercials talk before all the YouTube videos, and to read a garden magazine or something, or a garden website, to hear all those people talk. Even one weed in your garden means you're not doing it right, and you're not a successful gardener if you can't eradicate weeds. Check out this garden. This is my cowpea bed. My cowpeas are waiting to be pulled out. These cowpeas have done their job. They've grown. They've been a good ground cover. But you can see I got weeds all growing up in here. Some of these weeds are going to seed. And you know what? That's okay. I'll come every now and then if I see one, especially one like that that's got seed heads on it. I'll pull it up, throw it to the side, but I'm not gonna get worked up and think I've got an imperfect garden because there's weeds in there. I mean, look at this. I got morning glories growing all up in my peppers. I like morning glories. So here's an interesting weed. Do you know what this weed is? It's growing in my driveway. This is purslane. And purslane is actually a superfood, and it's cultivated all over the world. Not here though, but it grows wild. This purslane is not looking really healthy, but it's a good weed to have. So here's my rather ratty looking fig tree out in my front yard. This is my favorite fig tree, and it needs some trimming this coming spring, actually when it's dormant. And all these shoots here are going to be made into cuttings. But notice down in that bed there's some weeds down there. In the spring there's an interesting weed that comes up here that if I was really a stickler for weed control, I would pull them all out, but they reseed every year. And you know what they are? They're onions. They're wild onions that grow all in here. And so I get nice little benefits from that. You can eat some of the weeds. Don't get so uptight about the weeds. The weeds are certainly something you need to watch for when you are gardening, and when your new plants especially are coming up. Weed around your plants and cultivate. But you don't have to get so worked up about weeds that it's breaking your gardening will. You don't have to worry so much about weeds, and I wish somebody had told me that when I began. All right, so there are 7 more things I wish I had known sooner in my gardening experiences. I wish somebody had told me these things, or I had learned them earlier, but you know, that's the way it is. We don't always learn everything right away when we start. When we start out in gardening, we don't learn everything we need to know about gardening. We learn as we go. And so if you're new to gardening and you don't know all this stuff and you're still learning, and you've got some special circumstances that relate to your zone, your region, your soil type, or whatever it might be. Maybe you don't have any gardening property and you're constrained to containers only. Maybe you've got 50 acres of property and you want to know how to garden on a large scale. Not everyone's going to jump into gardening knowing immediately right away, okay, all I need to know is in my head now, I'm going to go out and do it. No, we learn as we go. We make mistakes. I encourage you just to garden, have fun and enjoy it, but listen to folks and research and watch videos and read broadly, experiment, and don't be bound to people's expectations. Don't be bound to the conventions that are out there that tell us this is how we must garden. It's not true. You can there's a lot of good best practices, that's for sure, but there are a whole lot of ways you can garden. So get out there, plant some seeds, plant some plants, get your hands dirty, enjoy the weather, grow some food, and enjoy your garden. Well, there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Black Gumbo Southern Gardening, and we're out there in our garden all fall this year, so we'll have some videos frequently, hopefully once a week at least. And we'd really appreciate if you subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We've also got an Instagram if you'd like to follow us there, and follow us on Facebook as well. All right, well, we'll talk to you next time. Thanks a lot, and y'all take care. Bye-bye.